All right, I think we're on air. So, Randall, how long have you been a religious apologist and been learning about the different arguments for and against the existence of God?
Well, let's see. I took a course on apologetics back in 1994 when I was doing my undergrad at Trinity Western University in Vancouver, Canada. And the professor was a Canadian apologist named Paul Chamberlain. He did a great job of kind of getting me excited and interested in the topic. We actually had William Lane Craig come and speak in our class, so 24 years ago. And I've sort of had my own interest in apologetics ever since then.
And you've done a number of debates and written a lot of books on the topic, so you're pretty well versed on this. But you've never really been convinced by any of the atheists' arguments?
Well, yeah, convinced, clearly not in the sense that I'm a theist and a Christian theist teaching at a seminary. But I do think that there are many good arguments for atheism, just as there are very good arguments for Christianity and for other worldviews as well. So, what a good argument is, to my mind, it's an argument that's logically valid and that has minimally plausible premises, preferably, of course, more plausible than their denials. And I think that one thing you'll find is that different people find different premises plausible. So an argument that could be a good argument and persuasive for one person may not be so for another person. And the fact is, I've never been more persuaded by the premises of an atheist argument than by their denials. So I'm not an atheist, but I do think that there are good atheist arguments out there worth considering.
So I'm an atheist, and by that I mean I don't believe there's any good arguments or evidence for the existence of God. And you said there were. Could you give me some examples of what you think are some good arguments? And then I'd like to tell you why I don't find those compelling, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Can I pick at what you just said a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, so you kind of already said you're going to tell me why you find what I say not compelling without knowing what I'm going to say. How does that work?
Well, I consider myself pretty familiar with most of the arguments. So if you came up with a new argument that I haven't heard before, I wouldn't be able to, but I'm assuming I've probably heard most of them.
Okay. Well, and let me just offer another observation that in conversations, it's both parties, they're probably going to have a more open exchange if we kind of don't set the table in advance. I think it's in all likelihood the case that neither you or I will be persuaded by the other at the end of approximately a 1 hour exchange. But I mean, we could say something that would persuade or nudge the other, at least in a direction closer to that other position. So I think we can at least agree on that much.
Sure.
Now, can I also ask, so the way you defined atheist, did I get it right that you said you're an atheist in the sense that you believe there are no good arguments for God's existence?
Yes, I would agree with something like Christopher Hitchens, who said, the atheist does not say there is no God. The atheist says there's no reason to believe in a God.
Okay, so by that definition, a Christian fideist who believes there are no good arguments for God's existence, but nonetheless they are for non-rational reasons a believer in God, they would be an atheist by that definition.
Possibly, sure.
Okay, so that would seem to be a defeater for the adequacy of your definition, because if a person would qualify as an atheist even while believing in God, you probably would want to revise the definition.
Well, I just adopt the definition because it's what's most used by most atheists, as far as I know, most big atheists. So it's mostly just a representation of the position. The definition itself isn't really important.
Okay. Can I maybe talk for a moment about solipsism? So you're familiar with solipsism?
Yes, the belief that your mind is the only thing that exists and everything else is just a construction of your mind.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. No other minds exist other than my own. So, of course, solipsism is for everyone who would espouse that a thesis held relative only to that individual. So with that in mind, can you give me an argument that would persuade me that solipsism is false? That would, that my claim that I'm the only mind that exists is false?
Just the methodological position, kind of like in science, we assume there is an external world and that we can learn things about this external world. Well, I would say we can assume that there are other minds and we can learn things about these other minds in the same sense as science by just making testable predictions. I can interact with you just like I can interact with this water bottle next to me, even though it may not metaphysically exist. We can still make predictions about those interactions.
Okay, but of course I could explain all of that data with respect to the workings of my mind.
Absolutely, and you could do the same with science too, and just say we're all part of the matrix. So I can't prove anything with absolute certainty, but I can still say generally it's reasonable to believe there are other minds, just like it's reasonable to believe the external world is a thing.
So, but you would concede that you couldn't provide an argument to show me that solipsism is false, but that, of course, wouldn't give me a good reason to think solipsism is true.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So by the same token, even if I fail to persuade you that theism is false, does not in and of itself give you a good reason to think theism. The fact that I couldn't persuade you to think atheism is false does not give you a good reason to think atheism is true.
Well, again, I'm using the negative definition of atheism as just a lack of, there is no reason to believe in a God. I'm not saying there is no God. So atheism, if it's true in my sense, just means there are no good reasons to believe in a God.
Okay. And how would you define a good reason? What would a good reason look like? It's like I gave you a definition a moment ago of a good reason for me. What was to be an intuitively compelling premise or a conclusion that follows validly from intuitively compelling premises? What would your definition of a good reason be?
Well, I would use my epistemology starts with there is some difference between my imagination and my experience. And so if you're making a claim about what actually exists in the world, you need to be able to have some criteria to differentiate those two things. And if you present that criteria and it seems to work, that would qualify as evidence for me. So if you can provide some methodology to differentiate between something that's just a part of our imagination and something that's a part of the world, and whatever passes that test would qualify as evidence.
Are you referring like to a principle of falsification, that you must be able to falsify something to show that it is true?
In general, yes.
Okay, so then with that in mind, how would you falsify your atheism? How would you propose to do it?
You would have to just present a good argument for the existence of God.
Okay, that seems circular. What would a good argument for the existence of God look like? Because that's what I'm asking. What is a good reason? You said, well, a good reason would be one that falsifies. So I said, well, what would falsify atheism?
If God came down and met us, or if I could pray to God and get a gold brick every time, reliably make testable predictions based on the assumption if a God exists, then we can do this test and get this result, something like that.
Okay, so something that is sort of an immediate sensory experience you have was the first one, or testable prediction. Those are your criteria for good arguments?
Testable predictions definitely would be testable predictions would be my primary source. Yes.
Okay, why? Like, I can see that one would have that assumption if one is assuming that belief in God is analogous to belief in a scientific hypothesis that is justified with respect to testable predictions. But I don't know, I don't accept that definition of God, that God is like a scientific theory. So why would you accept that definition?
So from my perspective, everything starts off as essentially just something in our heads, and then we have to demonstrate that it's more than that in a part of the world. And so we need some criteria to differentiate between the two, stuff in our head and stuff that exists in the world. And I use testable predictions as my criterion to do that.
Okay, so testable predictions. So we start off with just what's in our head. It sounds like you start off committed to the truth of idealism rather than realism, i.e. that there is an external world that corresponds to our mental events. I'm wondering then, how do you get to realism from idealism? How do you justify the claim that there is an external world rather than simply that there are mental phenomena experienced by minds, which may very well undergo normative, regular law-like behaviors that we can model, but nonetheless, we would only be modeling them as mental events, and we would be errantly thinking that there is an external material world that corresponds to those mental events. So how would you get from idealism to realism?
Well, my epistemology doesn't make a stance on the metaphysics. We could be an idealist universe or a materialist universe, or a, what's the other one? The half and half one?
A dualist universe?
Yes, dualist, that's it. So it could be either three of those, but my position doesn't make a difference between any of those. I take a methodological approach. I just say we have this experience, and if we want to say there's something outside of that, we need some way to differentiate it, and then we create a methodology for that, and that methodology would have to be testable predictions as far as I can tell is the best one that I know of. So I'm not actually saying there is absolutely an external world. It just seems that there's some difference between the things I'm experiencing and the things I'm imagining. I'm defining the difference as the internal-external distinction.
So is your position about an external world precisely analogous to your position about God, that we don't have sufficient arguments to justify either belief in an external world or God, and so you would describe yourself as an atheist, and likewise a realist, withholding belief in a real world?
Well, I would say, because I define things methodologically, I say because we have a methodology to define the real world, which is testable predictions, we now have reason to believe there is such a thing. And if there was a similar methodology for God, then I would say that would qualify as evidence for God.
But I already challenged that assumption, because I said what you've just described as these law-like behaviors could be still simply mental events. So I'm wondering, how do you get from like a George Berkeleyan idealism to an actual realism, that there are physical things out in space that correspond to the mental sensory experiences that minds undergo?
So I don't actually take a position on metaphysics. I don't care whether or not the universe is idealist or materialist or dualist. That doesn't make any difference to me. All I care about is the methodological difference between my experience and my imagination. So whether or not it actually truly metaphysically exists isn't a question I answer. It's like, for example, I'm currently holding a water bottle, but if we're in the Matrix, that maybe the water bottle isn't real at all. But from my perspective, I'm still apparently holding a water bottle. And if from a brain in the vat, maybe the water bottle isn't real, but I'm still apparently holding a water bottle. Or this could be a theistic universe, but I'm still apparently holding a water bottle. So the apparent holding of the water bottle is true regardless of whatever the metaphysical truth is. So my approach is just the methodological one, that it seems like there's an external world because there is a difference between my imagination and my experience. The truth of the matter, the metaphysical truth, isn't important to my position.
Okay, so you would say that it seems to you that there's an external world, and that in and of itself, that prima facie appearance that there's an external world is a rationally sufficient reason to believe there is an external world. But it does not seem to you that there is a God, and that's a rationally sufficient reason to take your definition of atheism. Is that would be
almost. So there's some difference between my imagination and my experience, and we have a methodology to differentiate between these two. That's essentially the only claim I've made so far. And so because we have a methodology to differentiate between my imagination and my experience, there's a reason to believe that my experience is not the same as my imagination.
Now, so if you have a theist like me, and it seems to me that my position with respect to God is analogous with your position with respect to a world external to your mind. So just as there has to be, I mean, you can point, as I've said, to regular law-like behaviors of the universe. You can point to that, but those could be explained still on a Berkeleyan idealism, or some kind of phenomenalist epistemology or metaphysic. So there has to be at some point that you are proceeding with it seems to me that this is the case, and this is consistent with what I'm experiencing. And so my first point is going to be that I'm in an analogous case. I mean, on 2 points. First point, I agree with you about realism. It seems to me that that's the case. It also seems to me that God exists. Would you have a problem with me taking that position as a starting point?
Well, I would say you need some way to differentiate between God existing and that just being a part of your imagination. If you have such a criteria, then I would say, yes, it is analogous to my criteria that there is some difference between my experience and my imagination.
Okay, I don't think that you've, to my satisfaction, shown that there's a difference between Berkeleyan idealism and realism.
I apologize.
Standard.
Oh, I apologize. I'm not, again, that's a metaphysical position. The only difference I'm arguing is like when I imagine a unicorn does not appear in front of me. Now, it could be the case that the stuff appearing in front of me is just a deeper level of my imagination or something, but that doesn't matter to my position, because there is still some difference between these two. When I imagine a unicorn does not appear in front of me. So there is some difference between the world I'm imagining and the world I'm experiencing. And that is all the only claim I'm making. They could both be just some deeper level of my imagination. I'm fine with that.
I think we're both would say we're epistemic fallibilists. I assume that we're both going to think that having knowledge or rational belief is consistent with being fallible epistemic agents, and thus with the possibility that our beliefs turn out to be false.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm also kind of dancing around this concept of beliefs that are properly basic. I take it are you familiar with that concept?
I am.
Okay. And so would you think, for example, that belief in an external world or belief in minds other than your own can be held as a properly basic belief rationally by an individual? Or do you think that a person needs to have arguments and evidence to justify or support belief in an external world or minds other than one's own?
I believe you need arguments and evidence. I don't believe they are properly basic.
Okay. I'm still not familiar then on what the argument you've given to show the falsity of solipsism is, or what
Oh,
argument you've given to show, or unless you're just saying, well, actually, we can't really believe there are minds other than our own. We can only hold that as a pragmatic methodological assumption.
yes, it's closer to the pragmatic methodological assumption. It's just there is some methodology to differentiate between my imagination and my experience, and I'm defining the thing that is the experience as the external world. Now, whether or not that metaphysically exists isn't a part of my epistemology.
Okay, so you believe, if I'm correct, that the vast majority of people in the world, of course, believe that there are minds other than their own. They believe that there is a world external to their mind. It would be your belief that they are irrational or unjustified to accept those beliefs?
I would say they are rational and justified because there is some difference between those two things. So we do have a methodology to show they could potentially exist methodologically.
Okay, still not clear on what the methodology is, but I think we're just going to go in circles at this point, so we should probably move on. So how would you define God? I think it's probably helpful we don't talk past one another, because of course there are all sorts of definitions floating around.
Absolutely. I try to be as close to the theist definition as possible. So something like an necessary, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving personal being, something like that.
Okay. Do you have any beliefs about those kinds of fundamental metaphysical questions that God is invoked to answer?
Oh, well, I believe there has to be at least something that is at least eternal to ground everything. But all the other ones, I think, are just pretty much ad hoc.
By eternal, do you mean always existing? Do you mean metaphysically necessary or something else?
Either of those would be possible. I don't know which, but either one would definitely be a possibility.
Okay. Are you familiar with the term ultimism?
Vaguely.
Okay, well, it's a concept used by the atheist philosopher J.L. Schellenberg, and I think it's quite a helpful concept here because it would be the view that there is some sort of ultimate metaphysical principle. Theism would be one answer to what that nature of that ultimate metaphysical principle is, but of course there could be others. So that sounds similar to at least you'd be there. So would you say that it's more likely than not that that ultimate metaphysical principle does not comport with the theist description, or are you really just agnostic about that question?
Well, I'd probably say it's not likely to be the Christian idea because of the problem of suffering, but there are definitely a lot of possibilities. It could be theism or deism or pantheism, naturalistic pantheism, polytheism, and all those different options.
Okay, so it's more likely than not that the theist or Christian theist definition is false because of the problem of suffering. What is the problem of suffering that would justify, can you present that argument that would justify your conclusion that it's more likely than not that theism is false?
Sure, if there was an all-powerful, all-good God, then he would have created the best of all possible worlds. We don't live in the best of all possible worlds, therefore there is no all-good, all-powerful God.
So why do you think there is such a thing as a best of all possible worlds?
Because I believe in objective morality, and I believe that that can be instantiated by the idea of the best of all possible worlds.
I believe in objective morality too, but it also seems to me that there's something conceptually flawed with the idea of a best of all possible world, in the same way that there's something conceptually flawed with a highest number. So what
How so?
Well, because you can always count one higher. You could always add a little bit more good to a possible universe. So how would you argue that there is such a concept as an absolute best possible world is a coherent one?
Okay, I would argue that the best of all possible worlds would be one where all wills have sovereignty over themselves and total freedom to achieve their will so long as they do not impose upon the sovereignty of others. That would be my description of the best of all possible worlds. So essentially, every will gets its own universe. You can do whatever you want with it, and all interactions are voluntary.
You have you have we all have intuitions, of course, that we're working with. My question is that what would give you the confidence that your intuitions about what a best possible world would look like are reliable intuitions? Because I think in many cases we've run up against this issue called in philosophy cognitive closure, which is the idea that in many cases we have good reasons to believe that our intuitions and our reasoning about particular topics is limited and flawed. Not that it's completely errant, but that it is not completely reliable. So my question would be, what justification do you have that the way you've described the best of all possible worlds really would be, in fact, the best of all possible worlds?
Well, it seems to me that any immoral action entails the necessary feature of being an involuntary imposition on somebody's will. And so if we can eliminate all such immoral actions, then that would be the best of all possible worlds because there'd be no immorality in it. And that leads me to the conclusion of the best of all possible worlds.
Now, you're familiar with the idea of greater goods, right? So,
Yes.
uh, what would what would ground your confidence that there could not be a morally sufficient reason, i.e., a greater good, that would allow a person's will to be imposed upon? Because I can, off the top of my head, think of all sorts of examples where one could have morally sufficient reasons to impose upon the will of another.
Well, I would say because if it was optional, it would be more moral than if it wasn't optional.
Can you say that again? If what was optional?
So my definition of immorality is any involuntary imposition of will. That is just anything that happens, it is immoral. And so any kind, if we can just make all of those cases optional, someone can choose to allow others to impose on them, in which case that would be totally fine. And it would eliminate the immorality of the action, making it a better world.
Like if a 3-year-old is going to reach his or her hand out and touch a hot stove and the parent imposes upon the child's will and prevents them from doing that, is that an evil action on behalf of the parent because they imposed upon the child's will?
Sort of. Based on my definition, that would be one immoral action to prevent a greater immoral action. And so it's justified because we don't live in the best of all possible worlds.
Okay, I think, see, again, I think that's a defeat or an objection, at least, to your definition, because I think it's actually a moral good that the parent would prevent their child from burning their hand on the hot stove. Why? But you're saying anyway that on your view that is an immoral action for the parent to prevent the child from burning their hand. But you said that the child's burning their hand would be a greater moral evil. So that does actually still invite another rejoinder, which is, well, then how do you know that when there are wills imposed upon one another in the actual world, that there is not, from God's perspective, a morally sufficient reason to allow those impositions?
For my definition, I define immorality as just any involuntary imposition of will. That is my intuitive understanding of what immorality is. And so a world where all interactions are voluntary would eliminate all immorality. It seems more moral to me if they were optional than if they were imposed upon involuntarily. That just seems intuitively to be immoral to me.
So how it seems that that statement is incoherent with what you said a moment ago, because you said the parent's imposition upon their child would be immoral by your definition, which again I stated I don't think that is correct, but that is your view. But then you stated that the parent is justified because the child's burning their hand would be a greater evil. But of course, the child willingly burning their hand is not an imposition upon the child's own will. It is the actualization of the child's own will. So how could that be evil on your definition when you define an immoral or evil action as one that is imposing upon a will?
Because I include nature's imposition on the will as also being immoral.
So or in this case, not nature per se, but, well, maybe I guess it would mean the laws of nature in terms of the properties of the stove burning the flesh.
Yes.
Okay, so that's an extended analogical understanding of imposition upon will. So your view is that if the child burns their hand and suffers, nature has imposed its will upon the child.
Or involuntarily restricted the will of the child in some way, yeah.
Okay. Do you think that a person can rationally disagree with your understanding of best of all possible worlds, and thus your objection to theism based upon suffering as you perceive it? Or do
Oh,
you think your arguments are sufficiently strong that it should rationally compel me to agree with you?
oh no, this is just my own idea, and I haven't been able to uh, talk about it enough to articulate it to the point where I think it would be compelling to everyone. So absolutely, people can rationally disagree with it.
So, well, this has all been very helpful and it's very interesting. Why don't I'll present you a moral knowledge argument. So, I know I'm sure you're familiar with moral arguments generally. What do you think of moral knowledge arguments for theism?
I think it's an, like a argument from ignorance. It's just saying, so if we have moral knowledge, then maybe it could come from a god, but it could also come from a lot of other sources, like an undiscovered super law of nature or something. We don't need a god for that.
Of course, the fact that something could come from something else is not a reason to believe it did. If um, I'm sitting in the living room, and then I walk into the kitchen, and the fresh baked cookies on the counter have disappeared, and my dog is sitting there looking guilty with crumbs on his muzzle. The best explanation, I would think, given all the data, is that the dog went on the counter and ate the cookies. There are other possible explanations, such as that the cookies, in fact, were eaten by invisible aliens, and the aliens put crumbs on the dog's muzzle to frame the dog. But of course, I don't consider that to be a serious explanation. So my first concern here is that simply saying there are other possible explanations does not entail that they are better explanations. So I'd want, you would need to show for an argument for moral knowledge that the alternative explanation for moral knowledge is better than the one I proposed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So from my perspective, I think all of those are just equally implausible. Like saying not in the case, your example is correct. The dog would be more plausible than the aliens. But in the case of morality, it seems like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being is equally as implausible as an eternal, all-powerful universe with just some super law, both having morality grounded in their nature in some sense. Those both seem equally implausible to me.
Okay. Well, with that as background, maybe we'll proceed and look at that a little bit more. So if I want to say that there are two basic ways of explaining events or states of affairs. One of those ways is to appeal to an agent cause, and another is to appeal to a non-agent cause, like simply an efficient cause. So, for example, if I'm driving into Minneapolis and there are rocks just strewn about in a random pile, as I'm driving into city limits, I don't automatically infer that the rocks piled up on the side of the highway are the result of an agent causal explanation. But if I'm driving into Minneapolis and the rocks spell out, "Welcome to Minneapolis," then I infer the better explanation, not the only possible one, but the better explanation is that those rocks were placed in that way with that degree of order by an intelligence. So there's that difference between agent and non-agent explanations. And you would agree with that basic division?
Absolutely.
Okay. So then the question is, when we look at the phenomena of our moral perceptual faculties, the question is, what is the better explanation of those faculties? Is it more plausible that they are explained through processes that ultimately include mind, a directedness that brings about us having those cognitive faculties? Or is it more likely that they were produced through processes that do not include a mind? So let me just describe, first of all, give an example of what I'm talking about, the kind of knowledge I'm talking about. And I'll give you an example from Leo Tolstoy that I often like to use. So Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist of the 19th century, he witnesses a public beheading. This is one of the last public beheadings in Europe at the time. And this is what he wrote subsequently to having observed this event. He said, "When I saw the head divided from the body and heard the sound with which it fell separately into the box, I understood, not with my reason, but with my whole being, that no theory of the wisdom of all established things, nor progress, could justify such an act. And that if all the men in the world from the day of creation, by whatever theory, had found this thing necessary, it was not so. It was a bad thing. Therefore, I must judge of what is right and necessary, not by what men said and did, not by progress, but by what I felt to be true in my heart. So what Tolstoy is describing here is what we would often call moral intuition, or we might call conscience. It is this intuitive perception of moral value and moral obligation in events and states of affairs as they unfold in the world around us, or as we consider them as possibilities. From those basic intuitive starting points, we then engage in discursive moral reasoning to develop more sophisticated and precise moral knowledge. But that moral knowledge begins with a fundamental perception of moral value and obligation. And it's, as I said, it's immediate in the same way that our sense perceptual faculties, when we experience vision, for example, we see things, then immediately we would describe it as a philosopher would describe it as being appeared to readily, for example, seeing red color. It's just an immediate presentation of the object upon us. In the same way, Tolstoy describes with the beheading the immediate presentation of a moral oughtness, that one ought not do this. So the question is, how best do we explain the fact that human beings have these moral cognitive faculties? They're not infallible, clearly, but they are nonetheless such that they can yield true beliefs and indeed knowledge about the world around us. And how would you explain the acquisition of this kind of moral ability?
I would see it just like any other mental phenomenon, like hunger. I'd say it's just a product of some natural phenomenon we might not have discovered yet, like an emergent property of something more fundamental in nature. Like maybe morality could be a super law that permeates the universe, kind of like gravity, and just interacts with our brain in such a way to produce these results.
Okay, that sounds like it's a just so story. Like there's no real precise content to explain what process would bring it about that we have this cognitive faculty. So, I mean, do you have something more precise, or are you just holding out for the possibility that we could come up with a solution?
Well, how does God do it?
Well, that actually doesn't seem to be very hard, I would think, when you have an omnipotent being. Why God would equip human beings with moral perceptual faculties, I think, is also quite clear, is that God wants human beings to acquire moral knowledge and to become moral agents. And maybe part of the reason why God doesn't give human beings perfect moral cognitive faculties is because there's a process of maturation that provides a morally sufficient reason for human beings to grow into knowledge. So I don't find the fact that human beings have moral perceptual faculties surprising at all on theism. I find it very surprising on atheism. And I'm wondering, apart from the prospect that we might someday discover, I'm not even sure what it actually means to describe a moral super law, but apart from that possibility, is there anything more that you would have which would give you confidence that your explanation is better than the one I proposed?
Well, I would just take your own explanation and say, well, it could, instead of being an omnipotent being, it could just be an omnipotent universe, an all-powerful universe. And the reason it gave us this moral law is the same reason it gave us all the moral laws. It's just a part of its nature. It's just like the law of gravity. It's just part of its nature.
Okay. Now, so one thing I want to say is that sometimes theists argue that the existence of objective moral value is problematic in an atheist universe. And I'm not of that view, because clearly one could hold a view somewhat like what Plato did, have an absolute Platonic good, and yet it wouldn't really conform to the personal agent definition of God. So it wouldn't be theistic, but it would nonetheless be moral realism. So I want to concede that that is certainly possible, that may be the case. But what I'm focusing on here is not the existence of perhaps this objective Platonic realm of moral value and perhaps obligation, but rather our perceptual ability to grasp it. What sort of process through natural faculties would give us the ability to grasp moral facts?
Yeah, so I'm not making the Platonic argument. I'm saying it's like morality is actually grounded in a physical particle or a physical wave that we haven't discovered that is transmitted through the universe, just like gravity is, as a function of some natural process. So and it interacts with our brain in some way, like gravity interacts with our bodies, and that's how it transmits to us.
What makes that a good explanation? What makes that a more satisfying explanation than the theist's explanation?
Or it's not. I'm just saying it's an equally plausible alternative. I see both as equally implausible.
Equally Equally implausible and equally plausible?
Well, I mean,
Or
those mean the same thing, but yeah,
okay,
equally implausible.
so or equally plausible. So you find the theistic explanation as plausible as the alternative explanation that you've proposed.
Yeah, but I mean, I see them both as really implausible, but they're equally plausible from the same perspective. So, like, if you see something as super implausible, then it's equally as plausible as any other implausible thing.
So, okay, so let's go back for a moment to your definition of atheism, right? Your definition of atheism was with respect to the absence of good arguments for God's existence. Now, why don't we add another alpha privative, so that the A of denial, and say atheism is the view that there are no good arguments for atheism, as you've defined it. It seems that you are now backed into an atheist position, at least with respect to this argument, because you're saying that you find both arguments for God's existence with respect to morality and the atheistic explanations to be equally plausible and implausible, which seems to be a defeater to your position.
I'm not sure I follow. Let me just see if I can. So I see. I don't think there's any reason to make any conclusions about what the true fundamental nature of reality is. It's possible it's theism, but it's also possible it's pantheism. I don't believe in either of these. They're just possibilities. And this moral law thing that I'm supposing, it's just a pantheistic kind of counter explanation to the theistic explanation of morality. So both could explain morality, which means the moral argument doesn't indicate theism because it works equally as well for pantheism. And so we should just stop and say, we don't, here's this just one thing we just don't know, which means it's not actually evidence for God. Does that make sense?
Well, so like when you say that you find arguments, the explanation I've given for a moral knowledge and the alternative explanation you've given equally plausible and equally implausible, it seems that you are losing the basis to say there's an asymmetry between our positions. Before you were suggesting, I understood you to be suggesting that you would have a better explanation than the one I proposed. But by failing to give a better explanation, you're not providing an objection to my argument.
So the reason pantheism would be preferable to theism would be because of the problem of suffering. But just let me list. So if we have a compass and you say the compass points north, and I shake the compass and it points in a different direction, and I shake it again, it points in a different direction. The compass doesn't actually point north. It's not evidence of that direction being north. It's just a broken compass. So my argument is that your arguments for the existence of God work equally as well for the existence of the lack of a God, like pantheism or deism or polytheism or transtheism or any of these other alternatives, which means none of your arguments are actually evidence of any of these conclusions. They're just a question we don't know the answer to. And so my position of atheism is just to say these arguments don't indicate anything. We just have to stop and say we don't know. That's my position.
Pantheism isn't the view that there's no God, though. Pantheism is the view that everything is God.
I'm getting my idea from Einstein and Spinoza, who have a more naturalistic idea of pantheism.
Um, well, but I mean, yeah. So, but the Spinoza's view is he was still, as famously described, God intoxicated. So it wasn't that he was saying there's no God. He was saying there's no personal God, but he was none as Christians or Jews understood it traditionally. But he is saying that everything is divine. That's what pantheism means. So it's quite different from atheism.
So I agree that there is some kind of eternal thing, and I can attribute that as to the definition of a God, an impersonal God. And since my argument is that the Christian idea is false, if you want to just define the eternal, all-powerful universe as God, I'm fine with that, because that would still work for the purpose of my argument.
So maybe we'll come back to my argument, which you've said you find it plausible, although not more plausible, but also not less plausible than the alternative you've given. Usually naturalists or atheists would appeal to neo-Darwinian processes to explain the acquisition of moral knowledge. You don't find those explanations satisfactory?
No, I wouldn't find those as a compelling alternative to an objective morality.
Well, no. So, but I'm assuming for argument, because we do agree on the existence of objective morality. I'm assuming that there is such a thing as objective morality, but I'm just talking about neo-Darwinian processes alone equipping us with the ability to grasp moral value and obligations. You don't find that? I mean, usually that would be invoked as the explanation. So I was a little surprised to hear you not appealing to it.
Yes, I do like those, but that wouldn't work as a counter argument in the way I'm trying to use it. So again, I'm trying to present an equally plausible alternative to theism, which is an objective morality, and evolution doesn't provide us with an objective morality. So I have to assert something else, which is my moral super law, and that's the alternative objective basis of morality.
Yeah, I don't think we're quite at this moment we're quite meeting one another in terms of understanding. So what I'm saying is, for example, that on this traditional view, naturalism, or well, sorry, naturalistic atheism reboot, naturalistic neo-Darwinianism. So a neo-Darwinian model that doesn't in any sense appeal at a metaphysical level to a divine being would explain the acquisition of our ability to perceive color by its adaptive advantage. So, for example, those people who can discern red and green tend to flourish, while those people who fail to distinguish red from green end up getting in traffic accidents at intersections. And you can then appeal to the ability to acquire sense perceptual faculties such as color ability to distinguish colors for its natural adaptive advantage. And a similar argument has been and can be proposed for the acquisition of moral knowledge, that moral knowledge has a selective adaptive advantage. You don't find that to be plausible?
Well, that's not the argument I'm making. That would be a different argument.
Sure. I'm just saying, why don't you find that? I mean, actually, I don't find that argument to be plausible either, so I'm kind of heartened. But I'm just curious as to why you don't find it a good argument.
Well, I don't see the evolutionary basis to qualify as objective in the same sense that theists usually mean the word objective. It seems like that would only qualify as a subjective grounds of morality, and so it wouldn't be a valid alternative.
But I'm not talking about the genesis of moral value. We agree that moral value objectively exists. I'm simply talking about the cognitive faculties that we acquire, which allow us to perceive the moral value and obligation which objectively exists.
I mean, it could work. It's possible that evolution randomly happened to get us to that point, but I don't see it as necessarily likely.
Good. So because I want to agree that I don't think it's a good explanation. And I was thinking about this morning, so I wanted to share it. So even though this isn't your view, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to explain why I don't think naturalistic explanations are adequate explanations for the acquisition of moral perceptual faculties. And the reason is because we know of examples of human beings that can flourish even in society, even though they lack moral perceptual faculties. The obvious example here being psychopaths, clinical psychopaths. In fact, clinical psychopaths do very well in some aspects of society, such as in business. There was Robert Hare, one of the leading experts on psychopathy. In fact, he developed the psychopathy checklist. He wrote a book called Snakes in Suits, where he looks at the degree to which psychopaths, clinical psychopaths, flourish in business environments. Many of them, in fact, are, for example, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, because business rewards the kind of ruthless and immoral behavior that is indicative of psychopathy. Other areas where they flourish include, for example, military battlefields. So with that in mind, it would seem that if psychopaths, those who lack moral perceptual faculties and those who have moral perceptual faculties can equally flourish in society, then neo-Darwinian processes alone would not select for the primacy of people with moral perceptual faculties, and thus I don't think that purely a neo-Darwinian process is adequate to explain our acquisition of moral perception. I still don't think that you've provided a good defeater to my objection, because even by your own account, you find my explanation as plausible as your alternative. And so again, I'm back at the point of wondering why you would not simply be a skeptic about your atheism, such as you define it, as surely as you are a skeptic about theism.
So if we had a box and you said there's a rabbit in the box and all of the evidence that you presented to indicate a rabbit also worked to indicate it was a lizard and infinitely many other things, and there was no difference between these conclusions or the evidence indicating them, then it would be reasonable to say that there is no evidence that there is a rabbit in the box. It's just the evidence points towards everything, which means it indicates nothing. The principle of explosion from falsehood, anything follows. So from my position as an atheist is that we don't know what's in the box. So if you claim there's a rabbit in the box, and I can show that all of your evidence also indicates a lizard, that shows none of your evidence actually indicates the rabbit.
Yeah, but I don't even like what you're assuming there is that your alternative, that there is a moral super law or some moral subatomic particle or something that we have yet to discover that will somehow explain the acquisition of moral perceptual faculties. I don't think that is even qualifies as an explanation. I think that because it isn't even defined precisely what you're hoping for, how that would even work. So I'm kind of at a loss. I don't think that we're at the point of saying we have two equally plausible alternative rabbit lizard explanations. Because yeah, if you really had two equally plausible explanations, then agnosticism is the appropriate response. But I don't find that you've provided enough content to your alternative to explain the origin of moral perceptual faculties to give you that degree of plausibility.
Okay, so how would you answer that from the theist perspective? How would you answer your own question and provide, how does God give us these? Like, could you give me a mechanical process or something that, how would God do it?
I don't know how God brought it about, just as I don't know how we have sense perceptual faculties that function. In fact, this is one of the interesting things in philosophy, is that sense perception theories, you have the adverbial theory, the sense data theory, the theory of presentation or theory of appearing in terms of philosophies of sense perception, they have really not notably advanced over the theories of ancient Greeks, such as what you might find in Plato or what you later would find in Augustine. So from a philosophical perspective, sense perception is a multiply mysterious phenomena. Just as consciousness, of course, is. I mean, if you study philosophy of mind, you know that consciousness, the idea, as Colin McGinn, atheist philosopher of mind, put it, how does gray matter produce technicolor phenomenology? Well, we don't know. These are really big questions. But the question is not how does it come about, it's the question is what category of explanation would be more plausible to explain how it comes about. And when I'm talking about moral perception, I'm saying the category of explanation that looks most plausible to explain how it would come about is an intelligent mind explanation. It's the agent cause that I described rather than an event or non-agent cause.
So you said you don't know how God can bring about morality, and I would just say the same thing. I don't know how pantheism and the superlaw do it, but those seem equally plausible. Then you said you think it's better explained by a mind. Could you give me why do you think it's better explained by a mind source?
Yeah, because to go back to the rock spelling out "Welcome to Minneapolis" as you drive into the city, uh, what allows us to infer properly that there is a mind explaining the placement of the rocks is that there is a cohesive fit between this sequence in which the rocks are on the ground at their relative geographic proximity to Minneapolis and language, the fact that seems to be spelling out in English welcome. And similarly, when we look at how a mind functions to grasp moral perceptual facts, well, unless there is an adequate non-agent explanation for the way that mind functions, there seems to be this perplexing fit, which we regularly, when we find that kind of fit, we do appeal to minds. For example, if you have a radio that can tune in to radio signal frequencies, well, the fact that it can do that is one reason that we infer that this radio has a designer behind it or a mind behind it. And I think we have the same phenomena when it comes to the human mind and its moral perceptual faculty. So unless you have a better explanation that does not appeal to mind, I think mind remains the best explanation.
So from my perspective, I don't see any difference between that and say like hunger or our sense of gravity. Like, so if we imagine 1,000 years ago or something before we knew what hunger was, it's just this sense in the brain, kind of like the moral sense. Would it be reasonable to just conclude that hunger was sourced by a being in some sense too?
No, because not necessarily, certainly, because I think in the case of hunger, just as arguably in the case of sense perception, we have known neo-Darwinian processes that could explain how hunger functions for the flourishing of the organism. If an organism never experiences hunger, it won't eat, it dies out, its genes don't get passed on. But I argued that it's not the same when it comes to morality, because you could have uh, psychopaths that have amoral agency and they pass that on because they do flourish, because morality doesn't serve flourishing in the way that hunger does.
Absolutely. So if we went back far enough in time before we understood hunger to the neo-Darwinian level and we didn't know what it was caused, would it then be reasonable to conclude that it was sourced by a being because we couldn't explain it?
At that time, it would have been perhaps, because that just shows us that the plausibility of premises and the adequacy of arguments is relative to the data set for the people who appeal to those arguments and premises.
Isn't that the definition of a God of the gaps?
No, God of the gaps. No, what I just said is in any case, an explanation is adequate. The fact that an explanation is adequate at T1, at time one, does not entail that it's adequate at all subsequent points. So, for example, a man may be convicted of murder because there is an eyewitness and there is a motive and his fingerprints are found on the weapon. But subsequently, there could be new evidence that comes up which shows, in fact, that he is not guilty after all. So while the jury was rational at the time, given the evidence they had to convict him, subsequent evidence may in fact show that he's innocent. And so it doesn't mean that the arguments were bad at the time. It just means that further evidence has now come to light. And I'm saying the same token, there may have been a time where where hunger could have had that kind of sufficient argument to invoke a deity, but if we have a neo-Darwinian process, perhaps it doesn't function that way any longer. And in principle, it's possible likewise with morality, that you could come up with an argument to show why the evidence I provided is not adequate to invoke a divine being to explain our moral perceptual faculties, but you haven't done it yet.
So from my perspective, I don't see the evidence, because you mentioned a court case where you can present evidence to indicate one or the other. In the hunger example, I think the evidence to indicate hunger or morality are sourced by a being isn't evidence. It just seems to me to be an argument from ignorance, which I think doesn't qualify as evidence from my perspective. I don't think it was good then, and I don't think it works now either.
Well, it's not an argument from ignorance, because I gave an example of how we justify inferring that minds are the best explanation for particular phenomena. I gave you the example of Welcome to Minneapolis. To infer that there is a mind that wrote out Welcome to Minneapolis is not an argument from ignorance, as if we have to somehow, that's a mere placeholder until we find some natural explanation to explain the placement of the rocks. Rather, that is, given all the evidence we have, the best explanation at the time. And likewise, I would argue, we know how minds produce things, how a mind can produce a radio that grasps radio signals. By analogy, we can know that a divine mind could produce created finite human minds that can grasp moral values and obligations. And I'm looking at why you would think that was not a better argument than your alternative.
So I totally agree with you on the Minnesota example with the rocks lined out. Absolutely agree, but I don't see the parallel to morality, because morality just seems to be, here is some phenomenon we can't explain, and it could be like hunger, where it just has a natural phenomenon, or it could be maybe sourced by a being. We don't know. Why shouldn't we just stop and say we don't know? Because all the other times in history where we've tried to attribute these unknown phenomenon to beings, we've been wrong as far as I can tell. Like we thought, like if we see lightning hit a guy in the middle of a field, it's like, oh, he must have done something to anger the gods. It must have been a personal source. But then if you understand electromagnetism, if you're standing in the middle of the field carrying a giant iron sword, well, it's highly likely that you're going to get hit by electricity. So how is this case of morality any different than all of the other times we've tried to attribute unknown explanations to gods?
Okay, well, when it comes to so natural explanations, I think we're back at you're sort of assuming that theism is an explanation that is working until some natural law is invoked. But of course, I mean, let's pull back a little bit. So what I pointed out is that we have two kinds of explanations going out into the world, right? We have agent causal explanations and we have non-agent causal explanations, like efficient causal explanations. And all the time, we find that some phenomena are better explained by agent causal explanations, like welcome to Minneapolis, and other phenomena are turns out they're better explained by non-agent causal explanations. And what I'm simply saying here is that in the case of moral perceptual faculties, given all the evidence we have, the best explanation is agent causal explanation. And that it doesn't entail God, right? I mean, it's possible that you could have well, there are aliens who are moral beings who created us, seeded Earth in a panspermia thesis, and they seeded us in such a way that we would acquire moral knowledge because they want us to have moral knowledge. That's possible. Minimally, what we have is from the argument is supporting a mind that created human beings and wants us to gain moral knowledge. And now this is consistent with theism. It's not consistent or what you would expect with atheism. But
So
you could say, sorry, one more thing. So you could say, okay, maybe it's aliens, and that's plausible with atheism. And I would say, okay, fair enough. So you're saying you have to at least have aliens.
Okay, so from my perspective, I would see in the case of the Minnesota example, the reason we can infer design in those kinds of cases is because we know how it was designed. We know the actual process by which those things are designed. We know how they're designed. We can use analogy to human design to infer other kinds of human design, but we can't really go beyond that. Like, for example, if we came across a spaceship that was designed by a kind of crystalline life form that we have no idea about, we would never be able to say that was designed. We wouldn't be able to identify it as anything more than just a rock. Or if we came across a designed spaceship by like a single-celled kind of intelligence that we have never seen before, again, we'd never be able to know it was designed. So the only kind of design that we can seem to infer is the kind of human design, or kind of analogy to human design. And I don't think we can really go beyond that to kind of like morality or logic or math or those kinds of things. So,
are you familiar with the Dyson sphere?
yes.
Yeah. So we've never designed Dyson spheres, and I dare say I'm not even sure how one would begin to, but we can certainly, and for those who don't know, I guess I should just say, so a Dyson sphere is the idea of when an alien civilization reaches a certain technological level of ability, what they could do would be to build a sphere around their star in order to capture massive amounts of solar energy. So theoretically, I mean, it's possible to build a Dyson sphere, but I dare say human beings don't really know how one would begin to do that. But we can nonetheless project and look out and look for evidence of Dyson spheres with respect to the dimming patterns of stars near to us. So I think that all the time we can look for evidence of intelligence, even if it is intelligence and technology that is beyond us and that we don't necessarily understand how it would function.
Well, that seems to me, again, to be like an analogy to human design. We're saying, well, we can use solar panels and capture energy from the sun. Therefore, well, how do we do this more efficiently? We can build a whole thing, a whole big building around a sun and capture all of its energy. So that still seems to be a design by analogy to human design.
Well, of course, whenever we're looking for design, this is one of the big questions in astrobiology or exobiology is how would we recognize intelligence in the universe if we encountered it? And of course, that is an interesting question. It's not entirely clear that we could or that we would, because there are some alien intelligences that conceivably could be so different from us that we might not even recognize their intelligence. Of course, nonetheless, we do the best that we can, such as the Voyager 1, I think they, or SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, right? We're scanning, looking for patterns of radio signals that would conform, for example, to universal mathematical patterns. So, I mean, it's not an insurmountable problem.
But it's also possible we find really complicated things that we haven't discovered yet that were produced by natural things or natural laws or natural processes that we just don't know about. And they produce this thing and we look at it and it seems kind of designed to us, but it's not. You would agree that that's possible, right?
Of course, yeah. So again, what we come back to is time and again, we have to look at, well, what is the best explanation of the evidence, such as we have it now? And in the moral perception argument I gave, I'm just saying neo-Darwinian processes alone don't provide the best explanation. I don't think your super law proposal has enough content to even constitute an explanation. So I'm just saying, given the evidence we currently have, I think the theistic explanation for our moral perceptual faculties or at least a mind explanation consistent with theism, is the best explanation.
Well, I would see your explanation of theism also doesn't seem to have enough content to constitute an explanation of morality either.
Okay, why is that? I mean, you're not familiar with the idea. I thought we had a definition of God that was kind of shared between us. So God is a agent, but in this case, a disembodied agent. So that doesn't make sense to you?
It does. I just don't understand how that would ground morality.
Well, I'm not asking about grounding morality. I'm talking about creating beings that have moral perceptual faculties such that they can perceive moral value and obligation. So it's an epistemological question of doxastic or cognitive faculties.
And that seems equally as plausible to me on pantheism, or actually probably more plausible given the problem of suffering on pantheism.
Okay. Well, we have here a draw. I think it's been a very interesting exchange, though.
Yeah, I greatly enjoyed talking with you. Thanks for being willing to come on and talk.
Well, yeah, Tom, let's do it again sometime if that works. But I very much enjoyed it. I think that you're a astute thinker and you're always questioning, and that's a good thing. And I think sometimes there's some of the conversations can get a little adversarial in this sphere, and I think that the collegial nature of our discussion has been very refreshing. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks again for coming on.
You bet. Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye.